Introducing Nose to Tail, a podcast where we explore the world of aviation lifecycle solutions, insights, and more. Presented by Jet Midwest.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Nose to Tail podcast. I'm Patrick Kraus, COO at Jet Midwest. I'm here with Bill Wilson. Bill, how you doing?
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. You're a pilot, and you've had an interesting career. And I'd like to maybe start at the beginning of your career, how you got enticed to coming into aviation and what career path you took to get that launched.
So I'm the oldest of four, and we're all only 18 months apart. And when I was going to college, I had a sister that was going to be coming up right behind me. So my mother asked me to explore ROTC, hoping that they could help pay for the college and, make the burden a little less on the family. So I looked into ROTC, seemed to enjoy it. I grew up with Hanscom Air Force Base in my backyard, but I wasn't one of those people that you hear about where it said he saw their first airplane when they were 5 years old and pointed up at the sky and said, "That's what I want to do." To me, it was just part of everyday life. It was nothing really that I aspired to at that age. Went through ROTC. They asked me what it was I'd like to do in the Air Force, and I said, I think I'd like to fly airplanes. And they have a screening program between your junior and senior year college where the Air Force pays for you to fly 25 hours with certain requirements. It's like a prerequisite to make sure that you could go on and compete at pilot training. Went to pilot training, found out I didn't like to pull G's very much, so or spin for that matter, and decided pretty early on that I wanted to pursue a heavy background. Again, not with the airlines as my primary focus. You'll certainly talk to folks that joined the military just because they knew they wanted to fly for the airlines. Flew KC-135s in the Air Force, had a great time, did that for 8 years total. In the late 80s, early 90s, the airlines were hiring, and the base that I was at was closing. So I applied to the airlines, wound up getting hired by American, and the next 34 years flying for American Airlines.
That's pretty wild, and it's amazing. 34 years at any job is really fantastic. So, it's got to be a great journey for you to have been there that long through the highs and the lows. Now, maybe remind our listeners who aren't aware, the KC-135 is actually a commercial variant. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that aircraft and maybe what the difference was flying for the military versus flying for American when you very first started.
The KC-135 was a Boeing 707 that was converted to give gas to other airplanes in flight. The version I flew had the early jet engines on it. They weren't terribly powerful. And it was kind of interesting because some smart Boeing or engine guy discovered that if you injected water into the engine as you were taking off, it would give you additional thrust. And that water would last for approximately 2 minutes. So the navigator would hack his clock when we turned the water on, and then he would give us a 110-second call, which meant that the water was running out in 10 seconds, and off you went. At the time, the airplanes I was flying were built between 1955 and 1962, and I was born in 1960, so I was flying airplanes that were older than I was. The guard units that were flying the KC-135 had old American Airlines, slightly more modern jet engines on them. And then eventually the Air Force went to I believe it's the CFM56, which is what's on 737s now. There's a lot of commercial airplanes that use that CFM56. And I never had an opportunity to fly that airplane. Air Force career was pretty interesting as far as being more regimented. Obviously, I was in the Air Force long enough to become a veteran of Desert Shield, which was the precursor to Desert Storm. And then I got out just before that, went to work for American Airlines. As far as the differences between the airlines and the Air Force, the principles of flying the airplane are the same, a slightly different version of the same jet. But the Air Force was obviously more mission oriented. You had to be where you were supposed to be when you were supposed to be there. And in the airlines, they like it to be like that. But they used to say for American that there is no mission. You just want to get the people there safely on time if possible, but it was basically about transporting people from one place to another safely, as opposed to the Air Force, which was somebody's depending upon you. You got to be there when you're supposed to be there.
It's interesting you talk about the old variant motors and how they've upgraded those aircraft. Those aircraft, some of them are still flying
Yes.
and still putting fuel
Yeah.
on military aircraft. That is a pretty cool journey just for that aircraft type itself. Now, when you very first started American, you got type rated, obviously on the KC-135. That was one specific flight. What type ratings were you getting for what aircraft were you being qualified on to start at American? And then how did your career transition in terms of the different type of aircraft and different type of commercial flights?
The airlines are very adept at taking aviators from all different backgrounds and training them the way that the airlines want them to be trained. Helicopter pilots, light aircraft pilots. My roommate at my first class at American was originally an Army helicopter pilot and then went on to fly King Airs for the Army. So he had no jet experience when he got to American Airlines. And he did just fine. So the airline basically trains you to be who they want you to be. It was a very easy transition for me because I was coming off the KC-135, or the military version of the 707. And my first job at American was a 727 flight engineer. And the engineer was responsible for all kinds of systems monitoring, making sure that the fuel was distributed properly, which was exactly what I did in the Air Force. It was the 727 used so many of the systems that the KC-135 used that it was a very, very easy transition for me to move onto the 737. Eventually, the airlines got rid of flight engineers, and my next assignment was I went to the MD-80, also referred to as the Super 80, which was basically the airline's version of a stretch DC-9. And I really enjoyed flying that airplane. I had over 6,000 hours on that airplane. We did short hops, long hops into all kinds of fields. I really enjoyed that airplane. And there was a lot of guys at American that didn't like the Super 80. They just thought that the cockpit was small, but I thought it was kind of like just a, I won't say a race car, but it was just a sports car. So I really enjoyed the Super 80.
Bill, just to interject here, I have this little smile on the inside. Early on in my career, post 9/11, when we started dismantling aircraft in Mojave, we bought, and this sticks in my head. It tells you how crazy I am, right? November 846A Alpha, which was an American Airlines 727 that we bought with no engines
Mhm.
on it, that we dismantled. I was just discovering the dismantle side of the business at the time. And I think it's great that that American airplane sticks in my head as my first 727 that we
Yeah.
tackled. And I don't know that I made very much money on that deal. I made some, but I don't know that we made very much. And then on the MD-80s, what a dynamically different aircraft, right? I bought many American airplanes in my career after they got
Mhm.
retired, and we had a great relationship, still do with American, but lots of MD-80s. And from a maintenance standpoint, they were flying tanks. I mean, these things were just amazing. On the maintenance side, they were great. I always loved the aft entry. I thought that that was really brilliant by McDonnell Douglas. So, did you see a big variant for yourself going from flying a Boeing aircraft for such a long time and then going into flying a McDonnell Douglas product? Could you tell the difference between the aircraft based on who manufactured it?
I don't recall it being that stark a difference between, making the houses get smaller, making the houses get bigger. That part, it was a matter of learning the new systems. And obviously, McDonnell Douglas did things a little bit different than Boeing did, but I still had plenty of confidence in the airplane. It was sort of the next step up from the primitive 7.0 and 7.2s that I was flying. A little more automated, a little more intuitive, as they learned more and more about how to build better and better airplanes. And that's going to kind of lead me into where I went from MD-80 FO, if you're ready to hear the next portion.
Oh yeah, we got to get to the 75s and the 777s
Well,
here.
I went from the MD-80 to the 777. And that was a leap. That was a pretty big leap. Um, Fortunately, a lot of the Boeing systems were the same. I mean, not specifically, but the concepts are the same. How they work the hydraulics, how they work the electrics. I mean, they still had almost, if I remember correctly, like the same flap handle. For me, it was going from that little race car to a Cadillac. And I know at some point you're going to ask me what my favorite airplane was. And hands down, the 777 was my favorite airplane. It was my first foray into international travel, which was exciting. Lots of flight attendants, lots of adventures. But to me, moving up to the 777, that was smooth and intuitive and just a wonderful flying airplane, a wonderful landing airplane, plenty of power. It was, to me, it was there's no better way to describe it than going from a Volkswagen bus to a Cadillac. It's by far my favorite airplane.
Bill, I think we can take I don't know if we're allowed to do it, but the 777 and call it the Cadillac of the skies would be pretty amazing because that's a great description. I'm a huge fan of the 777, both as a passenger as well as being in the aviation marketplace. It's been a great aircraft for us. So I love the idea of calling that
Yeah.
Cadillac of the skies. Now, maybe let's talk a little about some of the international destinations, right? Those are all international flights with that
Yeah.
aircraft. Talk about some of the great places you've been. What are the top places you've been, and maybe some of the places that you went that you're like, I don't need to go back there again.
To me, my airline career was focused more about being home and being a family man. I used to say I'd rather push a wheelchair at Logan if I could get the same amount of money as if I could fly a F-15 in LA. To me, it was more about being home. My career was somewhat limited by choice because I chose to stay in Boston. So in Boston, we only flew the 777 to London. And occasionally we would fly it down to the Caribbean if the airplane was going to be sitting around due to scheduling reasons. We'd occasionally fly it down to San Domingo. So if I was going someplace besides London, it was mainly because I had gone on a temporary assignment to Miami for the month. They had all kinds of South American destinations. They had European destinations. American didn't have a very big presence in the Far East, which was one of the places I would love to have gone. That was not part of American's route structure. So when I was in Miami, I bid to go to Buenos Aires. I wanted to go to Argentina just because I had heard so much about it. Unfortunately, wound up getting sick for that trip. I did wind up flying a daytime trip to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and that was awesome. It was the first time I had ever been south of the equator, flying over the Amazon, and it was daytime when I did it. Well, most of it was daytime, and eventually we landed at the nighttime there because it was just such a long flight. And then flew into Sao Paulo and wandering around the city with a captain and a first officer. We had two first officers at that time, but just wandering around the city with those guys, learning about how I had no idea that in Brazil they speak Portuguese. So it was nice to have a tour guide to walk around. I remember buying some bootleg DVDs while I was down there. So that was
Not for resale though. You didn't bring them back and sell them. You're
no,
not.
that was just
You're just a
you're
consumer.
just a consumer. Um, and then one of the longest flights I ever had was from London to LAX, and that was a long day. At the time, we still plotted our uh, coming across the Atlantic because you're not under radar control. We had to do reporting points to various air traffic control, for lack of a better word. It's not technically air traffic control, but they were monitoring the international routes over the Atlantic. And I still have the chart, and the chart has us further north from Boston than Aruba was south from Boston. We were like 1,600 miles north of Boston, which at 400 miles an hour is still 4 hours. Yeah, that was a long flight, but just absolutely love the 777.
Yeah, it certainly is a great flight, and you can fall in love with the city of London if you go there often enough. I've been to London more than a handful of times, and have absolutely loved
We've actually been back
staying
to
in
London
London.
on vacation before because we enjoy it so much. I'm going to be in London again next September. You can never run out of things to see in London.
Yeah, just take a left or a right. There's a whole new neighborhood, a whole new thing going on down
All
the
the
street.
museums, all
So
the the sights,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
attractions.
Well,
Yeah,
and certainly growing up as an American and having some common history, there's a lot of things that we relate to, and the common language helps as
sure.
well that happened in really all of the
Yeah.
UK. Let's talk a little bit about the airline approach when you started your career when it comes to pilots compared to the end of your career. I'm curious, and maybe it's the same. Maybe American was steady Eddie the whole time, but I'd be curious if you have a particular take on how the airline handled bringing pilots in and managing pilots compared to how they finished in where they are today.
I remember that 727 engineer school was 12 weeks, and now they can get a 777 captain trained in 4 weeks. All the simulators, all the systems, so much of it now is done online. Back when I went through the first couple of schools, even the 777, when I went through the 777 in 2003, that was sort of the tail end of the more hands-on teacher getting up in front of the class, teaching you about systems, things like that. Around, I want to say 2008 or so, I think they started to drift more towards computer-based training, CBT stuff, where you went to the library at the schoolhouse and just watched tapes of all the systems and practice tests in preparation for a giant comprehensive systems test at the end. When I was on the 777, it was towards the end of actually having to sit with a check airman and take an oral on all of the systems that were required to know in order to move into the sim phase. And he would just basically start at the top of the panel and work his way down the panel and then across the front, talk about everything. The thing typically lasted 2.5 to 3 hours. And you knew if you failed it, you were going to have to go back and do it again. And the check airmen were excellent as far as guiding you through it. Maybe he knew you knew the answer, but you couldn't necessarily get it out of your mouth. And so it was just different back then. It was so much more face to face, hands on than it is now at the airlines. And I'm sure it's all about money. It's all about not having twice as many check airmen so that you can have guys at the flight academy and guys on the line checking out new captains, new first officers, guys moving from one airplane to another. Obviously, it's very expensive to keep those senior guys on the payroll. Not that they fired them or anything, but they just found ways that they thought was better. Whether in the end it was or it wasn't, I can only speak for myself. I never felt shorted on my training, but it did seem like we learned a lot more on the line than we did at the schoolhouse.
I think with all things, if we can harness technology to improve the training methodology, and we want your very first statements earlier today is those airlines they want you to fly and be
Yes,
safe. And it's the safe journey. There's more about being safe than even being particularly on
correct.
time. And so I think that's just so long as we're harnessing technology to continue that pattern, I think that's great. And finding something else for those guys to do, they certainly are contributing somewhere. Let's talk a little bit about maybe what the future of aviation is from the perspective of a pilot. There's been a lot of conversations for many years about aircraft going to single pilot. We see drones, military style drones, and things that are flying around with no pilots. What do you think the timing is, or what do you think maybe are some of those hurdles that the marketplace is going to need to take to get to a single pilot aircraft for a commercial flight?
Well, is informal poll. Are you in favor of single pilot or pilotless um, customer transportation? You know what I'm saying?
That is a wonderful question to ask. We would get all of our listeners out there. You just got to ask this question. So I need you to comment whether you think you are in favor of going to single pilot. I think my answer is yeah, I am. I am in favor of exploring what it takes to go to single pilot. We haven't had a change in the design of uh, jets in a long time. We've been flying tube wing style designs for a long time. It doesn't mean that there's not innovation, and sometimes you don't need to fix what's not broken. But I do think that there might be something gained, especially if we can take some leaps in technology within the cockpit. the design of this 777 you're talking about that you got trained on, that design happened in the
Yeah.
90s. Those were the first computer designed aircraft. And so that technology that was integrated in the 90s had to be developed prior to that. So you can think about the actual age of each of those systems, and in each of those rotables on the aircraft and the things that are there were designed prior to that. And again, we're looking to fix what's not broken. If a slat actuator works, you don't need to go too crazy redesigning it because you kept the same core design. But I think when we start to see the dynamics of the future of aviation, is there a place for that? And is the test market maybe the freight aircraft? Is there a pilot in the cockpit and a pilot on the ground working remotely who's able to help do that? I'm not sure the answers to it. Um, I do know that the marketplace in aviation, from a regulatory standpoint, sometimes can be slow with change. We've seen that in our careers, which that's why aircraft don't, frankly, or they are as safe as they are. We don't have issues because they do take a long time to really get a product out there that passes all the
Right.
standards.
Yeah, all the kinks worked
So
out. And we've
yeah,
seen what happens when they rush
and
it, when the 7-8
that's absolutely correct.
and all those
Yep.
battery
And even
issues.
the 737 MAX
Yeah,
challenges
yeah,
and some of those things.
yeah.
From your standpoint as a pilot, we have a pilot shortage. Maybe that impacts the decision making to move towards single pilot aircraft, or maybe there's just not as much wow factor becoming a pilot today as there was in the 70s and 80s and in the past. Maybe get us a flavor. What is it that we need to do different to attract more people to become pilots and make this a more attractive career for people to pursue?
The industry in general is so cyclic as far as pilots go, and it does seem like where hiring tends to be on the tail end of the accordion effect, if you know what I mean. They overhire, then they under underhire. It just doesn't seem like it's something that can be smoothed out. And part of that comes from the amount of time it takes to train a pilot. And I don't mean how the airlines train the pilot. I mean what it takes to get hired at an airline. It's obviously an expensive hobby. It requires a certain level of intelligence. The individual has to be capable. And obviously, not everybody's capable. And I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. I'm just saying that some people, whether they don't lack of interest or they're left brain and would prefer to paint a picture than to see a picture, it's just the differences in people. Okay, so I understand your perspective as far as there being a pilot shortage. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of years we find ourselves with a pilot overage. It's just the way the nature of the business goes. Having been inside the industry, I realize that it is hours and hours and hours of routine. And that's a good thing. We've figured out how to analyze systems and components and understand when they're going to fail prior to when they actually fail. The problem is when they actually fail. And I have been in cockpits that were high stress due to some anomaly, whether it's the weather, a diversion, a medical emergency, some kind of a mechanical malfunction, some kind of problem. And it is a very taxing environment. And I don't see how one person could do that in the cockpit while somebody else on the ground is helping that's not really there. They can't actually put a hand on a flap handle. They can't put a hand on an engine cutoff switch or, any of those other things. If it was just routine, it would be fine. I maybe wouldn't have as much objection to it. But when the shit hits the fan, the shit hits the fan. And that's the time where that second or third person to me is irreplaceable, especially. And one of the things I thought maybe we'd get into as we get a little further into this is I think that the new pilots today are outstanding. They really are great. The new first officers I was flying with were really sharp individuals. But I think the industry is drifting too much towards automation. And by that I mean if we get it to be like a computer game, when some of those problems develop, you have to actually be able to click off the autopilot and fly the airplane. And so few in my experience, I can't speak for anybody. I can only speak for myself. Towards the end of my career, I saw the people I was working with relying more and more on automation and augmentation than actually clicking the autopilot off, clicking the auto throttles off, and just fly the jet. And it has sort of reared its ugly head with some of the accidents that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years or so. People didn't really understand what the airplane was doing or why it was doing what it was doing. And the results can be catastrophic. Maybe this is just sort of a long answer, but from a pilot's perspective, I don't want to see anything that makes it easier for companies to get rid of me.
That's fair. To your point on the safety of the aircraft and some of the challenges with training, the 737 MAX pre COVID, when those got parked because of the accidents that happened, those were tragedies. And, some of that I could see where the high quality of a pilot who had the same incidents like it was Lion Air in Indonesia that had one of the two almost back to back
Yeah.
accidents. When that happened, that was a known problem that a lot of the other airlines, the large airlines like American, I don't think American had Max at
Yes.
the time, but whomever did have them, they were already communicating about this is possible and this is what we did when that occurred. I forget what they call it. I think there is a specific write up that pilots do that gets submitted
Oh,
when they have the something like, hey, this.
yes, I should know this, but yeah, it's basically a report.
Yeah, you
Yeah, I
should know
should,
this.
but
You should have popped that right off the
yeah,
top of your head. You go back to
yeah.
training.
The pilots at American were in the forefront of keeping that system going. We started it, and then the other majors sort of picked up on that. I want to say it's not Folkwa, but anyways, I know what you're talking about, right? Where we,
Yeah, so you guys came up with your own
yeah,
procedure so that when that circumstance that those other pilots unfortunately weren't able to manage, you guys figured out how to manage it when that came up, and then you guys put that into, am I correct? You guys then write that up, and all the pilots then have this new procedure that when you run into this instance, you already have been debriefed on how to manage that and not have something
yeah,
catastrophic
that was
happen. I
APA.
think that goes to,
That was APA that did that. I just, as a matter of fact, you say this, I just watched a documentary on the 737 MAX that was done in 2002, and I had forgotten about so much of that stuff. But we actually had to go down to Dallas for where American's training center is, and spend a couple of hours in the simulator going over the revised procedures for that MCAS system's uh, possible failure. After watching that documentary, it's sort of changed my opinion a bunch, but I got to tell you, the airplane was a dream to fly. It really was a step up from the 737-8s that we were flying, 800s. It really was.
yeah.
I looked forward to flying that airplane, the Max.
I was on a Southwest Airlines flight Saturday and then again on Monday on a Max, and it was just amazing flights, both of them. Super comfortable aircraft and a great journey as a passenger.
Yeah,
And for my airline clients who operate those aircraft, the fuel savings operating those aircraft and the efficiency of the maintenance on them is better than advertised, which in most of this world rarely is something that
yeah,
expensive, better than it's actually
yeah.
advertised. So they were able to achieve some uh, again, fuel cost savings as well as some operational cost savings just based on their operation, which just saved them tons of
Sure.
money, and they're going to retire their older aircraft a little more quickly. When we talk about the future of aviation, it's a fairly large sector. Maybe you can give me some thoughts on electric aircraft potentially. I've seen some different variants of electric aircraft that are going to be entering into the marketplace, as well as maybe perhaps what vertical takeoff and landing, the VTOL transportation might look like. Being someone from Boston, there's some East Coast cities that are already implementing these sort of air taxis within some of these major metropolitan cities. As a pilot, what is your exposure, or maybe what are your just general thoughts on both electric aircraft as well as maybe some of those air taxi services being operated?
I don't have very much experience with any of that stuff. If it's safe and reliable and great, if you get an opportunity to use it, great. I don't have any experience on the limitations. I can understand space needs. I'm not quite sure how a aircraft that takes off vertically saves gas, to tell you the truth.
The vertical takeoff and landing aircraft are actually behaving more like helicopters within major
Mhm.
metropolitan cities, where you're going to a helipad. They're literally
Yeah.
launched off of helipads, but they're electrically powered drones. Some of them run on other power plants, but the ones that I've been seeing that are approved are actually operating, I believe, electric. And so you go from a helipad to maybe an airport. So if you're going downtown New York or in a major city, you can leave and take basically it's an air taxi to get you to, I don't know, whatever airport your private jet
Yeah,
probably is
Nashville
on.
or
If you
whatever.
want to,
Yeah, just land on a runway instead of land.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that, and we talk about pilots, I was curious as I started to explore that they have two pilots in the aircraft. It has to be treated like a commercial flight. You have two
Mhm.
pilots on there because it's a commercial flight. Even though you maybe have 4 or 6 or 8 passengers, it's still treated the same way. And again, if there was a popularity explosion in those, I would be curious whether we'd have to address safety and those types of things. But we don't need to linger too much on that topic. You mentioned it earlier, so I'm not going to be shocked when you say 777 is your favorite aircraft and why. Maybe give us the opposite. It's the first time I've ever asked this question. As a pilot who's flown a lot of different kinds of aircraft, what was the one aircraft that you go, if I didn't have to fly that ever again, either as a passenger or a pilot, which aircraft would that be and why?
I didn't fly any of the Airbuses. I've flown on the Airbus a bunch, but I never actually flew any of the Airbuses. Kind of relating back to your previous question about the vertical takeoff stuff, I think for me, anyways, and I want to say the majority of pilots, not everyone, but I would say for us, basically just put an airplane in our hands and we'll do whatever it takes to fly it safely to the destination. There are some guys that just hated the MD-80. I really enjoyed the MD-80. There were some guys that really hate Boeings, the guys that are flying the Airbuses. And then there's the Boeing guys that say, geez, I really hate the Airbus. I never felt that way about anything I was on, whether it was the T-37, the T-38, the 75, 76. I didn't feel that way about any of them. I just tried to do the best I could and learn as much as I could and enjoy it while it was happening. I didn't really think too much about the airplane I was flying. I was too busy enjoying the sunset or the sunrise or the meteor shower or just watching the ground go by. I didn't really have a love-hate with any of them. It was just a tool. I apologize. I can't give you something more concrete about that, but
It's all right. Listen, you love to fly. You
yeah.
love to be in the air. That's very clear to me, and it's great that you can have a career where you just have a passion every day. Like, man, I get to go do this, and that's awesome. And that career, that's why you could do one thing for
Yeah.
your entire
I
career.
mean, if I
So
could just close the
that's pretty
cockpit
cool.
and go fly and open the cockpit and go home, may still be doing it. But after 34 years and almost 20,000 hours, it was time to get out of the 3 on, 1 off, 2 on, 3 off grind, spending nights in hotel rooms and airport food and all that other stuff. It was just time. I'm just too old for that now. It really is a young man's game.
So, Bill, as a retired
Yep.
pilot, the current retirement age in the U.S. is 65 years old. We're not sure necessarily. And I guess the question for you is, does aviation need to adjust that age of 65 in your opinion? And if it does, what maybe are the obstacles to getting that accomplished?
I look at 65 through my own eyes. And when I first got hired at American, that retirement age was 60. And that was in 1991. That became the the light at the end of the tunnel. And it wasn't until I want to say it was 2008 that they changed it to 65. Well, in 2008, I was hoping to upgrade to captain. And when they changed it to 65, all of a sudden we stagnated. I wound up spending 5 more years stagnating as a first officer before I was able to upgrade to captain. Well, the financial aspects of that 5 years of first officer pay versus captain's pay was is actually, it's mind-boggling when you think about compounding and things like that. But I never was really an advocate for 65. I know there's been some discussion about increasing it to 67. I look at it from the stagnation point of view, but we've had 17 years for folks to sort of catch up, and there's no surprises for first officers. They pretty much know when they're going to retire, and all the guys that stayed those extra 5 years when they change it from 60 to 65 are all gone now. You're right. We are healthier than we used to be. We have more experience, those extra 5 years of experience. I suppose if you want to just to go from 65 to 67, then, go ahead. At some point, there has got to be a limit because even though we're healthier, the numbers are not in our favor as we get older. For me personally, the last few years was such a grind. I couldn't imagine keep going. The industry has changed so much, and maybe that was because I was still flying domestic hops as opposed to international long flights to get my 80 hours a month. It's almost two different airlines for the domestic guys versus the international guys. And obviously, the more senior guys tend to be more international guys. And who knows, maybe I would have enjoyed it more. But in Boston, getting back to my original comments about more about quality of life and family than it was about chasing the dollar. If we had international flights out of Boston to Europe or the Far East or wherever it happened to be, I uh, might have a different tune about this. But I was flying 2.5 hour uh, Chicago turns right up till the end, and that just beats on you.
It's a fair point. I used to travel quite a bit for work, 110, 120, 130 days a year. And even as a young man, and that's taxing. It is hard to keep yourself together when you get on a flight in the morning, spend one day in one city, and then the next day you get on another flight and fly somewhere else. So, well, listen, now that you're in retirement, are you doing any flying? Is there any particular aircraft or any aviation thing you're still involved in?
No. Every once in a while, it crosses my mind. I live on a lake, and a couple years ago, we were ice fishing, and a couple of light aircraft tail draggers flew over, and a bunch of us were waving at the airplane as it flew over. So it looped back around and landed on the ice and taxied back to us. And he just come over and chatted with us while we were on the ice. It was pretty cool. But it turns out that he owned the local FBO. So I got to talking to him about it. I was telling him about my qualifications, things like that. He said, "Well, just come on over. He could probably take you on a 45-minute flight and get you all checked out. You can do anything you want." At the time, it sort of intrigued me, but then I just got busy doing other things between my hobbies and my family and my association and my club, and just too busy to do other things. I never was particularly in love with uh, little airplanes, mainly because they're just slow. It's
You
just
got the need when you
slow.
get back in that Cadillac that you
Yeah.
wanna do.
Oh man, you mean it's gonna take us 15 minutes to get to 1,000 feet? I mean, come on. So, uh, anyways, it was an expensive hobby, and it just wasn't something that I was passionate about.
Well, that's good. You also said you've been flying for 20,000
Yep.
hours, I think is what you said.
Close.
You know, being a passenger and sitting in the back and maybe having your favorite cocktail while you're in the airplane might also be kind of a nice fresh
Yep.
change. So we oftentimes talk about stories. Everybody's got some good ones. I was curious of what your experience was when 9/11 happened, because you were obviously thick in your career with American Airlines at the time, and they lost an aircraft there tragically.
Shoot.
But maybe what was that like?
I took off that morning at 6:30 for Dallas. I was airborne when that happened. We didn't know anything had happened until we landed in Dallas. There was chatter, air traffic control calling various flights and telling them that your company recommends that you land at X airfield. That we just got word from your dispatch that your company recommends you land X. And then there was some brief spatterings on the radio, and I actually thought that a light aircraft had crashed into the Sears Tower in Chicago as an accident. And so when we landed in Dallas, we were taxiing, and ground control told us to get in line behind this giant conga line of airplanes that were waiting for their gate. And so I said, "We're only a couple minutes early. How come we have to get in that line?" And they said, "Contact your company. Contact your company." So at time it was cell phones were just starting to get mainstream. We were sitting in that conga line with one engine running, and I turned on my cell phone and I had 7 messages, and 3 were from my wife, uh, 1 was from my sister, 1 was from somebody I knew at American Airlines. And first I called my wife, and she says, "I just need to know that you're safe." And then we hung up, and I called my friend from American Airlines, and she had the names of the crew members. And that was the first I had heard. And I had flown with Captain Oganowski. I went to college with his brother. Um, I knew a couple of the flight attendants from Flight 11, the one that had taken off out of Boston. It was all just a total surprise to us. The airlines didn't have a protocol for a situation like that. And so they were just sort of winging it from dispatch. They were, doing the best they can. Obviously, phones are ringing off the hook from the 1,000 airplanes that are in the air. Folks want to know if their loved ones are fine. It was quite chaotic. And then that conga line was because maintenance was taking the airplanes off the gates instead of that dance that we do where airplane departs, another one pulls in, that airplane departs, another one pulls into that gate. So they were doing maintenance was pulling them off, taking them over to the hangar for storage, and then gradually put the ones that had just landed into place. But I remember walking into the terminal in DFW, which is a giant airport that's always buzzing, and it was so quiet. It was just so quiet that the TVs were on, but they weren't talking at all, because they get to control the stations in the airport. They weren't talking about anything. It was Animal Planet or something. I don't remember who was even on TV, but it was just so eerily quiet. And then I spent the next 5 days in a hotel in Dallas, and then came back. They flew us into Hartford because we're Boston based, flew us into Hartford. Logan was closed and bussed us basically to the parking garage. And then we just waited. And there's other parts to the story that I'm still emotional about, but that's the gist of it. It was,
Yeah,
in
I'm sure.
fact, my license plate on my truck is never forget. And, and that's sort of where my focus has become now, is more about being a veteran, keeping people's awareness that there's a lot of bad people in this world, and not that we don't get enough reminders on the news all the time, apparently. So, um, but anyways, it was something I lived through, and I'm grateful for. And for the longest time, right up until I retired, my daughter used to say, "You working on September 11th again?" And I really wish you wouldn't. I says, "But somebody's gotta, somebody has to do it."
Yep. It was certainly a transformative moment in, not just our country and world, but in aviation as an industry. There was a lot of transformation that came out of that, and the impacts are still there, and it's kinda smoothed out. It's become a new normal for us, with, the way that security lines work and cockpits, ballistic doors and some technology changes to cockpit cameras and things where you can see in the cabin. So, certainly a lot of changes came from that. You mentioned earlier some old salty pilots, probably Vietnam vet guys, and it doesn't have to be your story. Listen, remember, we can carry someone else's story secondhand into our own podcast here. I'm sure those guys were when you were flying 727s in 1991. Those old guys were your pilots or something. What is it, that one story that's always stuck out to you?
I remember I had been with American for like 6 months. And at that time, you had to go to the airport to pick up your paycheck. And I was based in New York. So that made things interesting going. I had to sort of coordinate for my flights so that I wound up in New York on the 15th and the 30th of every month just so I could pick up my paycheck. But there was a bunch of stuff on the pay stub that I didn't understand. So I asked the captain about it. He's explaining this and that. And then he looks at the total and he goes, "This is how much you've made this year?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I made more than that last month." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?" And then there was all this discussion about, "Oh yeah, they're going to have a dump truck full of money for you when you retire in 30 years." And it was, and I'm fortunate. I got a decent nest egg and I live on a lake and I got a great family, and it didn't certainly turn out to be a dump truck's worth. But some of the other stuff, the cool stuff I've done over the years, my folks were retired down to Fort Myers. And there were a couple of times where I'd bid my schedule so that I wound up in Fort Myers and I'd play golf and have lunch with my folks on the layover. Seeing fireworks from the sky is a lot of fun. I loved flying over the major landmarks. I loved flying over Niagara Falls, Pikes Peak, the mountains in the middle of our country, uh, seeing the mountains when you fly into Seattle and Portland, and you're on not final approach, but you're on the approach portion of the flight, and you're down below the level of Mount Shasta and Mount St. Helens, and that was got some really cool pictures of that. Some really cool pictures of racetracks at night. Flying up the Hudson is just an amazing view. When you fly up the Hudson and there's New Jersey on the left and Manhattan on the right, is just stunningly beautiful. Seeing comets, eclipses, weather balloons, thunderstorms, St. Elmo's fire, the Northern Lights, satellites, no UFOs. Sorry, don't want to disappoint you folks, but didn't see any UFOs.
That's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast, but it was wonderful. It was wonderful. There are some things I would love to have changed along the way, but you ride the wave you're on, and that was my wave, and it's been great.
Well, that's amazing. I love that you just rattled all of that off. And every time I had something that popped in my head, like, I've never seen the Northern Lights. Iceland Air is one of my clients, so I'm in Iceland every once in a while, and I've never seen them. Not in the airplane, not on the ground. So every time I had something in my head, like, "Oh, you picked it up. Yep, you saw that. Yep, you saw that." So that was really great. It's wonderful to take those experiences. Again, the joy of being in the cockpit isn't just the cockpit itself, right? It really is all the other things that comes along with being a pilot. So that's amazing. Well, Bill, I appreciate the dialogue today. It was fantastic having you on Nose to Tail. I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy our conversation. And to all of you out there who are listening, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Nose to Tail. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Presented by Jet Midwest.